Black Hollow was a town that seemed frozen in time, its streets always quiet, as if the wind itself feared to stir too loudly. The Dobbins estate loomed at the outskirts, a sprawling mansion of stone and darkened windows, its silhouette cutting against the fog like a blade. Locals avoided even glancing in its direction, speaking in hushed tones when the name was mentioned, their voices catching in the throat as though saying it aloud might summon the family's hidden wrath. The house was known for its opulence. Tall ceilings, polished floors, ornate carvings that celebrated wealth and taste. But beneath its refined exterior lay a precise, chilling order, an invisible architecture of control and secrecy. It was the kind of order only a mind that relished the intersection of beauty and cruelty could create, a mind that could orchestrate death as one arranges flowers in a vase, each petal carefully placed, each space calculated. The first casualty appeared like a shadow falling across the town's fragile calm. A child no older than 7, the daughter of a laborer who had been quietly dismissed from town affairs. She was found in the Dobbins garden, limbs folded unnaturally as if someone had arranged them to mimic sleep. Yet the eyes were wide, frozen in a gaze that no one could unsee. The town's constable hesitated at the scene, noting the lack of evidence that could implicate anyone but fearing the Dobbins name carried a weight beyond law or reason. Families closed their shutters, mothers whispered prayers over trembling children, and neighbors offered silent glances to one another. The unspoken understanding that someone had crossed a line that could never be spoken of aloud. The investigation began, but it moved as if through molasses, hindered by fear, superstition, and the subtle, invisible influence of a family whose power was both social and psychological. In the mansion, unseen and unbothered, the Dobbins moved with deliberate calm. The patriarch walking corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, eyes that seemed to follow, approving of methods perfected over generations. The town did not know, could not know, that what they saw as wealth and refinement hid a mind meticulously attuned to manipulation, one capable of turning ordinary life into a stage for horror, and that the child's death was not an anomaly, but an introduction to a pattern of control, fear, and calculated destruction that would soon become impossible to ignore. A sense of dread began to seep into the town itself, subtle at first, a whisper in the wind that carried the weight of unseen horrors. Black Hollow, once merely quiet, now stood on the edge of unraveling, its innocence fractured by the precision of a mind that understood death not as an end, but as a tool, a symbol, and a statement. The Dobbins family had never buried their dead in the soil of Black Hollow. Instead, the bodies of their kin were housed in the deep, cold crypts beneath their estate, rooms carved into the bedrock like tombs of a forgotten empire. The locals, whispering behind drawn curtains, spoke of these chambers with a kind of reverent fear, half in curiosity, half in terror, as though the very act of acknowledging their existence could summon a curse. The family's rules regarding death were strict, enforced with the same methodical precision that defined every other aspect of their lives. No priest, no doctor, no lawman could enter without the patriarch's consent, and even then only under circumstances that the Dobbins allowed, on terms dictated by them. When the next death occurred within the family, a young girl named Lydia, barely 10 years old. The official reports claimed a tragic accident, a slip from a staircase no one dared examine closely. But those who knew the family understood immediately that the accident had been staged. Her body was carried to the crypts, laid on a slab as if sleeping. Her features untouched, yet frozen in an expression of terror. The positioning of her hands, the alignment of her limbs, the subtle tilt of her head. Everything was deliberate. Dr. Harrow, a physician called under the guise of official procedure, noticed the faintest trace of a rare toxin coursing through her system, one that slowed the heart and tightened the muscles long after death had come. No one outside the family could have known of its existence. The town whispered that the Dobbins were not merely preserving the dead but controlling them, making each death a statement, a ritual performed to maintain power over life and fear over the living. Fear wrapped itself around Black Hollow like a suffocating shroud. Mothers kept children indoors and fathers crossed the street when passing the Dobbins gates, the once neutral mansion now a symbol of surveillance and silent menace. Authority itself faltered in the face of inherited power and the eerie calm of a family that had perfected the art of concealing atrocities beneath elegance and refinement. In the shadows of the crypts, death became both spectacle and instrument, each body a carefully composed symbol of control. Black Hollow was no longer merely a town. It was an extension of the Dobbins mind, shaped by unseen hands, a place where questioning the dead was forbidden, and where even the investigation of a child's death could awaken consequences far beyond comprehension. The first body discovered outside the Dobbins crypts was that of Lydia, and even in death, she was not free. She had been arranged at the drawing room of the mansion, seated on an ornate chair as though attending an invisible gathering, her limbs stiff and unnervingly symmetrical, her eyes wide in a frozen stare that seemed to accuse anyone who dared look too closely. The scene was so precise, so unnatural that it suggested more than mere concealment. It was the signature of a mind that viewed death as artistry and life as a tool to manipulate. Dr. Harrow, called in by the authorities under pressure from whispers of the town, studied her carefully. Her veins had traces of a rare toxin, one that acted slowly and silently, constricting life while leaving the body outwardly untouched. It was a substance that required patience and planning, tested meticulously beforehand, suggesting a methodical mind capable of sustained cruelty and anticipation. The room smelled faintly of cedar polish and candle wax, masking the subtle metallic tang of death, as if the Dobbins had rehearsed the presentation for maximum psychological effect. Harrow noticed the meticulous care in the arrangement. Her hands folded over her chest at the perfect angle, her feet aligned so that they pointed directly toward the doorway, the head tilted slightly toward the mantel where a family portrait hung, watching. It was more than staging, it was framing, turning a child's death into a statement, a silent communication of dominance and precision. The townsfolk avoided the estate entirely, speaking in low murmurs about what they had seen or feared, their words heavy with the weight of terror and disbelief. No one dared connect the family to previous deaths. The wealthy were untouchable, their secrets protected by fear, inheritance, and authority. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Each death had the same signature, unnatural positioning, subtle poison, and an atmosphere designed to unsettle those who stumbled upon it. Dr. Harrow felt a creeping awareness that the Dobbins mind extended far beyond ordinary cruelty. It was ritualistic, obsessive, a careful orchestration of life and death as if the world itself were a canvas. And yet it was cloaked in normalcy. The room, the house, the appearances of wealth and refinement were all masks hiding the methodical horror beneath. As he left the mansion that evening, the town seemed different, muted, as if Lydia's body had drained color and hope from its streets. A slow, oppressive dread clung to the air, marking the beginning of a pattern that would soon engulf the town completely. For Lydia's death was not an anomaly, but the first visible thread of a tapestry of evil that had been weaving itself quietly for decades. Black Hollow had begun to feel the weight of a predator mind that worked in silence, in plain sight, and no one could say where it would strike next. Dr. Harrow, compelled by a mixture of professional duty and creeping horror, began to trace the history of the Dobbins family, uncovering a lineage that stretched back over 2 centuries, each generation more peculiar and cruel than the last. Records in the town's archives were sparse, deliberately vague, and often rewritten, as if the family had spent lifetimes manipulating memory itself. Yet fragments remained, a ledger noting the careful placement of bodies in the estate's early crypts, an old diary describing a child resting in perfection after a mysterious accident, letters that alluded to poisons tested on servants and animals alike. The family's obsession with controlling death was evident from the beginning, each patriarch and matriarch refining techniques that blurred the line between ritual and science, morality and obsession. Harrow discovered accounts of a great-grandfather who had meticulously arranged the bodies of livestock in geometrical patterns on the estate grounds, claiming that the alignment brought harmony to life itself. Servants who dared question him disappeared quietly, their fates recorded in the family journals with notes such as placement completed or lesson absorbed. It became clear that the Dobbins did not view death as loss. They saw it as an instrument, a message, a deliberate exercise of power. Harrow's unease deepened when he learned that many of the deaths in the town's history previously assumed to be accidents, epidemics, or unfortunate mishaps coincided with the family's presence, suggesting a long-hidden pattern of manipulation and control. The killings were never random. They followed a rhythm dictated by the family's twisted logic, often targeting the most vulnerable. Children, servants, outsiders, anyone whose life could be claimed without attracting direct suspicion. Harrow noted the recurring use of methods that were both subtle and horrifying. Poisons that acted over days, tools designed to immobilize without immediate harm, the careful positioning of corpses to create a sense of order that concealed chaos, and even psychological torment that left victims alive yet trapped in fear before death arrived. This revelation painted a picture of a mind not only psychopathic but painstakingly meticulous, capable of orchestrating horror in ways society could not easily recognize. Yet the Dobbins' genius was their ability to cloak these atrocities in civility. Their estates were immaculate, their public persona charming, philanthropic, respectable. Evil moved unseen, embedded in the fabric of everyday life, and townsfolk were complicit, willingly or otherwise, in their silence. Harrow realized that the mansion itself was a tool of control, its architecture a mirror of the family's psyche, hallways that twisted perception, rooms designed to isolate, crypts that were both preserved and displayed. Each death became a lesson, a demonstration of mastery, a signal to anyone who might question authority that life, when touched by the Dobbins, could be molded, manipulated, and ended according to their precise design. And still, Harrow noted, there was a pattern beyond method. A ritualistic obsession with symmetry, control, and the appearance of peace, as if the family sought not merely to kill but to choreograph terror. Black Hollow, as Harrow now understood, was a town held hostage not by law or weapons, but by the quiet perfection of death. A carefully maintained spectacle that forced compliance through fear of the unseen and the meticulously staged. The past, woven into the present, made clear that the family's reach had never been broken, and that Lydia's death, far from unique, was the first visible echo of centuries of calculated evil. The town's silence was not ignorance but survival, a fragile barrier between life and the precision of the Dobbins mind. Harrow left the archives with a sinking awareness. Understanding the Dobbins' history was only the beginning. The family's present and future actions were as inevitable as the ticking of a clock, a slow countdown to horrors that had been rehearsed long before any outsider could intervene. Black Hollow itself had become a living testament to the persistence of a mind that could shape, control, and annihilate with calm precision. And the realization filled him with a dread that had no end in sight. The mansion was more than a home. It was a maze designed to confuse, intimidate, and conceal. Dr. Harrow, guided by a nervous but determined housekeeper who had served the family for decades, began to move through its corridors, each step weighted with unease. The walls were lined with portraits, their eyes painted with such meticulous realism that they seemed to follow him, judging his intrusion, reminding him that he was not alone in the house, and that nothing here existed without observation. It was the first time he truly felt the scale of the Dobbins mind at work. Architecture as a psychological instrument, interior design as a reflection of methodical obsession. Floors creaked in deliberate places, ceilings tilted in ways that shifted perspective. Rooms were larger or smaller than they should have been, creating subtle disorientation. And beneath this deceptive elegance were hidden chambers, doors disguised as paneling, staircases that led nowhere, walls that opened to reveal vaults of horror. In one room he found the remnants of a past ritual, furniture arranged in a precise geometric pattern. A faint residue of wax from dozens of candles and the skeletal remains of a small animal posed unnaturally. Limbs extended, head tilted as if in silent supplication. Harrow realized that these chambers were laboratories of control, rehearsal spaces for methods perfected over generations, each detail an exercise in precision and patience. It was not merely killing that the Dobbins pursued. It was manipulation, the creation of fear, and the framing of death as performance. In another chamber, he uncovered documents detailing experiments with sedatives and toxins, their effects catalogued meticulously, notes on timing, muscle response, and the slow constriction of life itself. The handwriting was immaculate, almost clinical, yet the content revealed a mind capable of exquisite cruelty, one that measured suffering as carefully as a craftsman measures wood or stone. The family had tested these methods not only on animals but on unwilling servants, selected for vulnerability, intelligence, or defiance. Their reactions logged as data, their bodies disposed of or preserved in ways that communicated both control and contempt. Harrow felt the full weight of their legacy pressing down. The mansion was not a place of residence, but a mind-made material. Walls and floors, corridors and chambers embodying the psychopathology of generations. Each hidden door, each secret space was a testament to foresight, patience, and a perverse love for order and ritual. It was here in these hidden chambers that the Dobbins transformed death from accident to instrument, from consequence to message, using space, position, and concealment to amplify terror. Harrow noticed subtle signs of recent activity. The faint smell of burned herbs, small scratches in the stone floors, and dust that had been deliberately disturbed. It became clear that Lydia's death was only the beginning. These chambers were active, not historical. Someone was still rehearsing, experimenting, perfecting methods that could claim more lives. The realization forced him to confront the unimaginable. The Dobbins mind was not dormant, and its reach extended beyond the mansion, beyond the town, into a network of control maintained through fear, secrecy, and silent compliance. The hidden chambers were not merely repositories of horrors past, but engines for horrors yet to come. Harrow left with a sense of urgent dread, understanding that each room, each artifact, each methodical placement in the mansion was a message, a silent demonstration of power over life and death. Black Hollow, as he now grasped, was an extension of this labyrinthine mind, and any attempt to intervene would require more than courage. It would require understanding a psyche so meticulous, so patient, and so utterly remorseless that it transformed cruelty into art. The town was entwined in the mansion's design, and no one, not even an investigator, could predict which thread of horror would unravel next. It was not until Thomas Redgrave, a traveling merchant unfamiliar with Black Hollow and unburdened by its local superstitions, arrived, that the Dobbins' influence began to reach beyond the town's insular fears. He had heard only vague warnings murmured about the family's eccentricities, but curiosity and the promise of trade led him to the mansion's gates. He entered with an unguarded confidence that the townsfolk no longer possessed, and it was precisely this confidence that made him a target. The Dobbins observed him immediately, their eyes hidden behind polite smiles and refined manners, studying his habits, noting his routines, and identifying the small ways in which he could be unsettled. Unlike the townspeople, he was unaware of the invisible rules that governed the estate, the careful choreography that dictated who lived and who was prepared to die. Within days, subtle manipulations began. A misplaced object in his room, whispers of things that never happened, rooms that seemed to shift when he turned his back. Harrow, observing from a cautious distance, recognized the methodical precision at play. The family's interventions were invisible yet deliberate, designed to create uncertainty, fear, and isolation. Thomas began to sleep poorly. His eyes darkened, his steps hesitant. The mansion itself seemed to conspire against him. Doors that locked without reason, corridors that led nowhere, shadows that appeared to move independently. But it was the psychological torment, executed with the patience of centuries, that proved most effective. The family tested his responses, measuring anxiety, fear, and compliance, documenting reactions with meticulous attention in ledgers hidden beneath floorboards and behind panels. Then came the subtle physical manipulations, a rare toxin in his morning tea that left his muscles slack and his heart racing, an herbal compound that blurred the line between wakefulness and sleep, all without leaving outward evidence of their intervention. Harrow watched the transformation with growing horror. A man once confident was reduced to tremulous uncertainty, his perception of reality warped, his mind bending to the Dobbins' will. Yet Thomas's end was not immediate. The family's genius lay in prolonging suffering, in orchestrating terror that was slow, invisible, and psychologically devastating. Each step, each misstep, each moment of hesitation was calculated, catalogued, and used to perfect the next stage of torment. Unlike previous victims, Thomas's outsider status made him unpredictable, and the family treated this unpredictability as a challenge, an opportunity to refine methods of control over minds resistant to submission. Harrow realized that this was not merely cruelty. It was experimentation, research conducted on human beings under the guise of civility. And still, all of it was cloaked in normalcy. Tea served with perfect manners, small conversation designed to disarm, gestures of hospitality that hid intent as completely as the mansion's hidden chambers. The terror was structural, psychological, and unavoidable, and Thomas's eventual death would be more than a simple outcome. It would be a carefully staged demonstration of mastery, a silent message to any who might observe. Black Hollow, already suffused with fear, felt the ripple of these events even beyond the estate walls. As rumors of Thomas's fate began to spread in fragments and whispers, reinforcing the unspoken rules of the town, avoid the Dobbins, speak nothing and survive. Harrow, now fully aware of the family's capacity for methodical and ritualized psychological terror, recognized the magnitude of what he faced. The Dobbins were not merely killers. They were engineers of fear, architects of death, and scholars of suffering. The first outsider had entered their domain and in doing so revealed that the family's reach was not confined to Black Hollow alone. The mansion, the town, and the victims within its orbit were instruments of a mind that had spent generations perfecting a system of control. Each death a carefully measured calculation, each reaction recorded and each outcome used to refine future manipulations. Harrow left the estate that night, aware that the true danger was no longer only Lydia, no longer only the townsfolk. It was the unstoppable and meticulously trained mind behind the walls of the mansion, ready to turn any unsuspecting visitor into a lesson in terror. Black Hollow had become a laboratory for a living psychopathology, and every street, every shadow, every hesitant glance of its residents bore witness to the precision of the Dobbins' design. The investigation took Harrow deeper into the most intimate and horrifying aspects of the Dobbins family's methods. Their mastery of poison, not as a blunt instrument of murder, but as a refined tool of psychological and physical domination. He discovered that the family's skill was a centuries-old craft, perfected with patience, precision, and a clinical obsession that few could comprehend. Recipes were meticulously recorded, each formula tailored to create a specific physiological effect. A toxin that would first induce sleeplessness, then a creeping paralysis of the limbs, followed by hallucinations so vivid they seemed to overlay reality itself. Others were engineered to be nearly imperceptible, acting slowly over weeks, gradually weakening organs while leaving external appearances untouched, making death appear natural, inevitable, and wholly ordinary. Harrow realized the genius of the Dobbins approach. Death, when methodical, became invisible. Fear, when subtle, became suffocating. The family had studied human biology, chemistry, and psychology, blending them into an art form so precise it could terrify without immediate notice. Harrow traced the lineage of these techniques, noting how each generation refined dosage, timing, and method to achieve maximum effect with minimal exposure. Early documents showed that children and servants were often the first test subjects, those whose absence could be explained away, whose suffering could be logged as scientific data without scrutiny. There were notes describing careful monitoring of heartbeat, respiration, and neurological reactions, charts depicting responses to combinations of herbs, minerals, and chemical compounds. The Dobbins had studied not just how to kill, but how to manipulate the mind while the body remained alive, creating victims who were half-conscious witnesses to their own demise. One page described a child who, under the influence of a particular concoction, would perceive the room as constantly shifting. Furniture growing and shrinking, walls breathing, shadows crawling until terror itself became a tangible presence. Harrow shuddered as he realized this child had been alive throughout the process, their agony an experiment in the mind's susceptibility to fear. And yet the family's cruelty was not limited to physical or psychological manipulation. They staged each death with ritual precision, arranging bodies, garments, and objects in ways that created order from chaos. A grotesque aesthetic that signaled mastery and communicated power to any observer. In Harrow's mind, he could almost see the slow progression. Introduction of the substance, gradual deterioration of health, growing paranoia, orchestrated hallucinations collapse into weakness, and finally death framed as serene, almost intentional in its beauty. The artistry lay in invisibility, the terror in patience. Beyond the mansion, Harrow began to map patterns across Black Hollow and surrounding towns. Sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, and long-standing family rumors aligned with Dobbins' visits and patterns of behavior. Even those who had survived encounters described lingering malaise, nightmares, and a sense of being watched, proof that the family's art extended beyond death into the very soul of those they touched. Harrow's analysis revealed a deliberate strategy. By combining biology, chemistry, psychology, and ritual, the Dobbins created an ecosystem of control where life itself could be bent to the rhythm of their will. Fear was a constant companion, and death was both predictable and invisible. The realization weighed heavily on him. To confront the Dobbins was not merely to expose killers, but to engage with a mind trained over generations in the mechanics of terror. A mind that had elevated cruelty to a science and ritual to an ideology. Even outside the mansion, even outside the town, the poisoner's art threatened to spread quietly, unnoticed, leaving despair in its wake and reinforcing the illusion that the Dobbins were untouchable, untarnished, and invulnerable. Harrow recognized that understanding their methods was not enough. He would need to anticipate their patterns, predict their logic, and confront a level of patience and precision that exceeded any conventional measure of morality, law, or human endurance. And yet, despite the horror, he pressed on, driven by the need to prevent further victims, to expose the intricacies of a mind so meticulously cruel that every death, every illness, every hallucination was part of a grand, systematic design. Black Hollow itself seemed to pulse with the lingering effects of this mastery. Every street, every home, every whispered caution a testament to the reach of the Dobbins poisoner's art. Harrow soon realized that the Dobbins family did not operate in isolation. Their reach extended beyond the mansion, threading into the town itself, entangling those who had sworn loyalty or submission in an invisible web of compliance. He uncovered evidence of collaborators, neighbors, tradesmen, and even minor officials, who knowingly or unknowingly reinforced the family's control over Black Hollow. These individuals were not inherently cruel. Many acted out of fear, habit, or the subtle coercion that the Dobbins excelled at. Yet their actions, however mundane, created a network that allowed the family's horrors to remain hidden, their influence undisturbed. Harrow traced the patterns. A grocer who delayed delivery of certain medicines to mask symptoms of slow-acting toxins. A midwife who reported children missing or ill under the guise of natural causes. A carpenter whose construction choices concealed hidden passageways within homes and barns. Each participant, knowingly or otherwise, was a cog in a system designed to control life, manipulate perception, and hide death behind ordinary routines. The Dobbins had perfected the art of psychological leverage. Promises, subtle threats, and carefully administered favors ensured compliance without explicit demands. Harrow observed how fear was layered with obligation, creating guilt and loyalty simultaneously. A schoolteacher excused absences without question. A town clerk filed falsified death certificates. A doctor misdiagnosed illnesses. Each small act, each silent nod, reinforced the illusion of normalcy while the mansion's hidden chambers continued to refine torment and death. In his notes, Harrow documented how the collaborators often became instruments of punishment themselves, unwittingly perpetuating the family's rituals. A butcher might deliver meat that had been subtly poisoned. A gardener could track the comings and goings of potential outsiders. A maid might misplace an object, triggering anxiety in a visiting victim. All of it was orchestrated to create a seamless extension of the mansion's influence into the town. A subtle assertion of power that left no trace yet altered the trajectory of lives. The most disturbing discovery was the psychological conditioning the Dobbins employed on collaborators themselves. Letters, ledgers, and personal accounts revealed methods of slow persuasion. Careful rewards for compliance, reminders of past misfortunes reversed only through obedience, and hints of an unknowable threat for defiance. Harrow realized that the town was no mere bystander. It had been systematically molded into a mechanism of silence and complicity. Yet even within this network, cracks appeared. Some collaborators were uneasy, their hands trembling as they executed orders, their eyes betraying guilt or fear. Harrow could sense which individuals were likely to falter under scrutiny, offering him the possibility, however slight, of intervention. The family's genius lay in balancing control with flexibility, maintaining dominance without overt coercion, ensuring that each participant believed their actions were voluntary or necessary. This made the web almost impossible to unravel. No single person held the full picture, and those who might resist often did so too late. The town's collective memory was manipulated through fear, ritual, and secrecy. What was remembered became suspect. What was forgotten became weaponized. Harrow felt the oppressive weight of this realization. The Dobbins' power was not solely their own. but a social and psychological system that relied on human compliance at every level. To confront them was to confront the entire network, the invisible hand of a family that had mastered control through subtlety, intimidation, and methodical cruelty. Every street, every household, every whispered interaction was part of their design. And yet, despite the complicity, Harrow noticed the faintest signs of resistance. Hushed warnings, glances exchanged with caution, the tiniest sparks of fear untempered by submission. These were fragile, but they offered a path forward. Understanding the collaborator's role was not merely academic, it was tactical. If the network could be disrupted, the mansion's isolation weakened, the rituals exposed, and the family's dominion challenged. Black Hollow was no longer simply a town of fearful observers. It was a theater of control, each citizen a potential agent or obstacle in the Dobbins' silent, calculated domination. Harrow knew that to dismantle this system would require precision, patience, and an understanding of human behavior as meticulous as the Dobbins' own. The collaborators were simultaneously shields and vulnerabilities, and the next step of investigation would reveal just how far the family's influence had spread beyond the mansion, into the very fabric of the town itself. Harrow's investigation led him to the mansion's most disturbing secrets, the rituals that shaped the Dobbins' cruelty, transforming murder into ceremony and control into devotion. Behind locked doors and hidden stairways, he found evidence that the family did not simply kill. They orchestrated each death to serve as a lesson, a warning, and a psychological imprint on those who witnessed, aided, or survived. The rituals were precise and symbolic, reflecting a twisted philosophy in which fear, obedience, and mortality were inseparable. Victims were selected carefully, children and servants for their innocence, outsiders for their curiosity, family members for perceived weakness. Each ritual followed a pattern that combined biology, alchemy, and theatricality. Harrow discovered journals documenting the sequence. Initial isolation to heighten vulnerability, exposure to sensory distortions or toxins to erode reality, and finally a ceremonial passing that codified the victim's death into a performance of the family's authority. One account detailed a servant forced to trace a labyrinth of candles, mirrors, and cryptic symbols while under the influence of hallucinogenic herbs. Every misstep was noted, every hesitation measured. The end was always fatal, yet framed as a moral or instructive conclusion, reinforcing the Dobbins' supremacy in the minds of witnesses. Harrow noticed a recurring theme: the meticulous preservation of the victim's body and environment after death. Limbs were positioned to suggest submission, eyes directed toward symbolic objects, garments arranged to reflect hierarchy or guilt. Every corpse became a tableau, a silent testimony to the family's mastery of life, death, and perception. Beyond the physical arrangements, the psychological consequences were deliberate and cruel. Survivors were haunted by the ritual's memory, conditioned to obey through fear, and branded with knowledge that the Dobbins' control extended beyond immediate observation. The family's methods exploited instinct and imagination, ensuring that even those who escaped physical harm could not fully escape the ritual's reach. Harrow also uncovered the use of symbolic implements. Knives etched with arcane patterns, vessels containing combinations of herbs and chemicals, garments dyed with substances designed to mark both the living and the dead. These objects were not merely tools, they were instruments of authority, reinforcing the family's omnipotence and instilling terror in anyone who recognized their purpose. In his analysis, Harrow noted that the rituals served multiple functions simultaneously, as executions, as lessons, as reinforcement of hierarchy, and as a form of art that codified the family's philosophy. Each act of cruelty was a carefully calculated statement, a demonstration of control that extended into the town, shaping behavior, loyalty, and perception long after the immediate victim had perished. Witnesses described the feeling of being trapped in a living nightmare, where time slowed, senses became unreliable, and the line between reality and illusion blurred. Harrow realized the genius and horror of the Dobbins design. Terror was not spontaneous, it was cultivated. The rituals were layered with subtle manipulations, ensuring that participants internalized obedience and helplessness. Even those removed from the mansion reported the echo of these ceremonies, rumors, shadows, and sudden unexplained deaths that suggested the ritual's reach extended far beyond its physical location. Harrow understood that confronting the Dobbins would require not only courage but also comprehension of this elaborate system of fear. Every movement, every object, every calculated pause in the ritual was a demonstration of methodical evil, an assertion that even the laws of nature were subordinate to the family's will. The shadows of the mansion, the silent corridors, and the meticulously staged rooms became more than locations. They were instruments amplifying dread and solidifying control over anyone who dared to investigate. And yet, despite the carefully orchestrated perfection, Harrow noted faint inconsistencies. A candle slightly misaligned, a mirror reflecting the wrong angle, a victim's reaction that did not conform to the expected pattern. These small deviations suggested that even the most precise system had vulnerabilities, opportunities that could be leveraged to uncover truth and protect the living. Harrow's determination hardened. The ritual was no longer an abstract concept, it was a tangible manifestation of the Dobbins philosophy, a structured mechanism of terror, and a challenge that required intelligence, patience, and unflinching resolve to confront. Every step forward was fraught with danger, yet necessary for the town of Black Hollow, and for the fragile humanity still lingering under the weight of centuries of silence depended on it. Harrow's persistence finally forced a crack in the Dobbins' impenetrable facade. Hidden within a small, dust-choked study, he discovered a collection of personal journals, letters, and ledgers that had been meticulously sealed for decades. The documents bore the signatures of family members, written in painstaking detail, confessing acts so methodical and horrific that they seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. The confessions revealed the inner workings of a mind that had mastered cruelty as both an art and a science, a mind that cloaked obsession and sadism beneath civility and charm. Harrow read accounts of children restrained for hours in claustrophobic spaces designed to distort perception, subjected to cold and hunger until compliance became instinctual. The Dobbins documented every reaction, every flinch, every tear, noting how fear could be quantified and manipulated with alarming accuracy. Some entries described servants who were forced into participating in the death of others, instructed to act with detached precision as though following an academic exercise rather than committing atrocities. The language was clinical, devoid of empathy, yet tinged with pride, as if methodical evil were a discipline to be perfected over a lifetime. Among the papers were letters exchanged with distant relatives, revealing a broader philosophy. The family's belief in control as a natural hierarchy where life and death were merely instruments of power and compassion a liability. These communications contained instructions for continuing rituals, recommendations for collaborators, and meticulous records of each victim's psychological deterioration. Harrow noted with unease that the Dobbins had an uncanny ability to foresee human reactions, predicting the ways fear, guilt, and shame would propagate through witnesses and participants alike. The confessions also uncovered the family's attempts to manipulate the town's perception. Deaths were disguised as accidents, disappearances written off as misfortune, and misdiagnoses used to hide slow-acting poisons or deliberate injuries. Every act of violence was simultaneously a social experiment, a psychological assertion, and a mechanism to reinforce the Dobbins' dominion over Black Hollow. One particularly chilling journal entry detailed a young child placed in a reflective chamber, surrounded by mirrors and candlelight, forced to confront distorted images of themselves until reality itself became suspect. Harrow realized that the Dobbins did not simply kill. They fractured the psyche, creating terror that would outlast physical death. As he documented each confession, he began to understand the perverse logic underpinning the family's longevity. Secrecy, manipulation, and the subtle corruption of ordinary citizens had allowed their rituals to continue unchallenged. The town itself had become a silent accomplice, with generations conditioned to obey, avert their gaze, or rationalize the unexplainable. Harrow felt the oppressive weight of this revelation. The confessions were not merely historical artifacts. They were living instructions, a blueprint for understanding, countering, and perhaps preventing further atrocities. He also discovered personal contradictions within the documents. Fleeting moments of guilt, hesitation, or recognition of cruelty that had been quickly rationalized, suggesting that even in the most disciplined mind, humanity lingered in shadowed corners. These cracks offered him hope, evidence that the family's control, while vast, was not absolute. The meticulous records provided more than insight, they provided strategy. Harrow began mapping patterns, noting recurring victims, repeated collaborators, and the psychological levers the Dobbins used to maintain obedience. He recognized that the family's genius lay not merely in acts of cruelty, but in anticipating the reactions of others. The spread of fear, the shaping of memory, the orchestration of silence. The confessions also contained confessions of failed experiments, victims who had resisted, collaborators who faltered, and rituals that had gone awry. These missteps, though rare, revealed the vulnerabilities of a system that had seemed invincible, showing that human unpredictability remained a force even the Dobbins could not fully contain. Harrow carefully cataloged these vulnerabilities, realizing that the documents themselves were a key to dismantling the family's web. By exposing patterns, understanding methods, and tracing psychological manipulations, he could begin to untangle the influence the Dobbins had woven into the town and the minds of its citizens. Yet the revelations were suffocating in their intensity. Each page carried the weight of lives destroyed, innocence violated, and fear institutionalized. Harrow understood that confronting this history required more than courage. It demanded comprehension, resilience, and the ability to translate horror into actionable knowledge. The confessions unsealed a reality that was both grotesque and instructive, forcing him to confront the magnitude of the Dobbins' methodical evil while also providing the roadmap for countering it. And in that moment, Harrow recognized the paradox of the family's power. It depended on secrecy, compliance, and the calculated manipulation of human perception, but it also contained the seeds of its own undoing, hidden within the very documents meant to immortalize their dominance. With the confessions in hand, Harrow prepared to challenge the family's rituals, confront their collaborators, and illuminate the shadows that had allowed Black Hollow to remain silent for generations. The documents were no longer just evidence. They were a reckoning. Harrow stepped into the Dobbins estate with a trepidation that pressed against his chest like a living weight. Every corridor was a corridor of anticipation, every door a threshold between the normal world and the calculated darkness that had shaped decades of terror. The mansion, outwardly resplendent with polished wood and glimmering chandeliers, concealed chambers of horror that no outsider had ever documented. The air itself seemed heavier here, laden with the residue of long-committed acts that blurred the line between life and death. Harrow's investigation revealed a deliberate architectural design intended not for comfort but for manipulation. Hidden staircases, rooms with mirrored walls, and corridors that looped subtly to disorient anyone unfamiliar with the space. These features were not eccentricities. They were instruments amplifying anxiety, obedience, and vulnerability. In the library, he discovered a concealed panel behind a row of encyclopedias, revealing a spiral staircase descending into subterranean chambers. Each step was carefully worn, suggesting frequent use, and the scent of damp earth mixed with faintly metallic traces hinted at ritual activities far removed from the estate's opulent facade. The basement revealed rooms designed to fragment perception and induce fear. One chamber was lined entirely with mirrors, reflecting occupants into distorted versions of themselves, while another was dominated by a shallow pool of water, illuminated from below with objects submerged just beneath the surface, forcing visitors to confront their reflections in a state of unease. Harrow noted subtle markings on the walls, remnants of previous experiments, symbols, dates, and initials, evidence of the Dobbins' obsession with control and cataloging human responses. In the deepest room, he found what could only be described as the family's sanctum, a circular chamber where light, shadow, and architecture converged to create an oppressive atmosphere of inevitability. At the center, an elevated platform bore the faint stains of ceremonial acts, a stage for the rituals that had dictated life and death for generations. Harrow realized the purpose of this room was multifaceted. It controlled perception, reinforced hierarchy, and codified terror. Every inch of the space was engineered to dominate those who entered, to remind them of the family's omnipotence, and to ensure that memory of the acts committed here would remain indelible. Along the walls, he found personal effects of victims, garments, small toys, notes written in trembling hands. The Dobbins had collected these remnants, preserving them as both mementos and instruments of psychological influence. The juxtaposition of innocent objects with the chamber's oppressive design revealed the deliberate layering of trauma, a methodical engagement of fear, guilt, and hopelessness that transcended mere cruelty. Harrow observed, the meticulousness of the family's cataloging. Each object had been carefully positioned, each placement calculated to reinforce narrative control. This was not chaos, it was precise ritualized terror, a blend of artistry and cruelty that had allowed the Dobbins to perpetuate dominance over both victims and witnesses. He also uncovered traces of experiments that manipulated time, perception, and endurance, devices that controlled light and sound, chambers designed to isolate senses, and sequences meant to blur the distinction between reality and hallucination. The family had weaponized human perception, turning the mind itself into a battlefield. Harrow understood that the mansion's architecture and design were extensions of the Dobbins psychopathy, physical manifestations of the family's philosophy that control, fear, and submission were the highest expressions of power. Moving deeper into the dark heart, he found signs of recent activity. Candles extinguished too recently, faint footprints and subtle displacements of objects suggesting that despite the mansion's age, the rituals were ongoing. The family's reach was not confined to history. It persisted, active and deliberate. Harrow felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Documenting these spaces was not enough. Understanding them, predicting their use, and countering their psychological design would determine the survival of those who remained in Black Hollow, and the exposure of the family's crimes. Every corridor he mapped, every chamber he cataloged, every object he recorded was a step toward dismantling the machinery of terror the Dobbins had perfected over generations. He recognized patterns, the way rooms funneled victims into predictable paths, how light and shadow were manipulated to create disorientation, and how the mansion itself acted as a silent enforcer of obedience. The Dobbins psychopathy had not only shaped behavior, it had shaped space, memory, and perception. Harrow concluded that confronting the family would require more than bravery. It would demand comprehension of a system where architecture, ritual, and psychological conditioning merged into a weapon, and where failure could result in immediate and permanent loss. And yet, within the oppressive darkness of the mansion, he also found small fissures of hope, overlooked markings, subtle inconsistencies, and traces of human error. Even in a system designed for absolute control, unpredictability persisted, and that unpredictability would become the key to unraveling the Dobbins' grip. With every step, Harrow internalized the lesson. Evil could manifest in both people and structures, and understanding its architecture was as vital as confronting its perpetrators. He left the basement with a renewed resolve, aware that the mansion's dark heart had revealed not just horror but strategy, and that in its corridors and chambers lay both the methods of the Dobbins crimes and the clues to their eventual undoing. Harrow returned to the mansion at dawn, the air cold and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that seemed to precede confrontation. The documents, the maps of hidden passages, and the knowledge of rituals had prepared him. But nothing could steel the mind against the tension of entering the Dobbins domain for the first direct confrontation. Every shadow seemed to stretch and bend, every step echoing in the silence like a warning. As he crossed the grand foyer, the polished floors reflected a distorted version of himself, an unwelcome reminder that the mansion had already begun to influence perception. The Dobbins family awaited him in the central chamber, a space purposefully designed to induce submission and awe. The patriarch, silvery-haired and calm, projected the same composed presence that had maintained control for decades, while younger members watched from the periphery, their faces trained in detachment that betrayed the meticulous grooming of obedience. Harrow observed the calculated precision of their movements and posture. These were people who had internalized control as instinct, who could convert ritual into armor. He confronted them with the confessions, the journals, the evidence of sustained and deliberate cruelty. The patriarch's eyes, sharp and unflinching, regarded each document with a faint trace of recognition, not of guilt, but of pride. The family's legacy had been preserved exactly as intended. Harrow detailed the experiments, the chambers, the psychological manipulations, speaking in measured tones that contrasted with the charged atmosphere, ensuring the full weight of observation fell upon them. The Dobbins' reactions were careful, subtle, revealing nothing to casual scrutiny but betraying a mind constantly assessing, calculating, adapting. For the first time, the family encountered someone who understood their logic fully, someone who could anticipate reactions, expose patterns, and name rituals. This recognition, though unspoken, was palpable, and the patriarch's calm exterior quivered imperceptibly. Harrow moved through the house, tracing hidden corridors, revealing the secret passages and chambers, narrating each step of calculated terror, exposing how each design element, each ritual object, and each carefully manipulated fear had functioned. The younger Dobbins shifted slightly, a micro-expression of apprehension betraying the years of psychological training meant to render them unshakable. As the confrontation progressed, cracks began to appear in the family's armor. Subtle errors in recollection, contradictions in ritual explanations, and glimpses of doubt emerged. These were small, almost invisible, but to Harrow they were monumental, evidence that even the most disciplined psychopathy was not infallible. Using these fissures, he traced responsibility for individual acts, documenting not just the crimes themselves, but the mechanisms that allowed compliance and participation. The family had relied on silence, intimidation, and subtle coercion. Now exposure threatened the continuity of their empire of terror. Harrow's method was deliberate. He did not seek spectacle, but comprehension. By naming the rituals, the methods, the manipulations, he undermined the invisible scaffolding that supported the family's dominion. The patriarch's composure eventually faltered under the weight of understanding, realizing that the meticulous control relied upon for decades could be dissected and codified, that the knowledge he had sought to conceal was now public, mapped, and impossible to ignore. One of the younger Dobbins, the heir apparent, finally exhibited visible anxiety, a rare tremor in the cultivated mask of calm. Harrow had anticipated this the moment when the family's internalized rules clashed with the reality of exposure. He observed with clinical precision as guilt, fear, and the instinct for survival began to override decades of conditioning. The confrontation became a slow, deliberate dismantling of authority. Harrow's narration detailed each symbolic space, each instrument of psychological cruelty, each calculated act of suffering, connecting them to the individuals responsible. By naming the patterns, he stripped the Dobbins of anonymity and invincibility. The family could no longer hide behind charm, lineage, or ritual. Every act was laid bare. In these moments, the mansion itself seemed to respond, shadows lengthening as if to mark the end of secrecy, the collapse of control. Harrow documented the reactions with precision, noting the hierarchy within the family, how the exposure destabilized the younger members first, leaving the patriarch isolated, stripped of influence, confronted with the full historical and moral weight of his legacy. By the end, the Dobbins' aura of untouchability had evaporated, replaced by the human fragility that had always existed beneath the cultivated veneer. The mansion, a silent accomplice in terror, now bore witness to reckoning, its corridors echoing not with manipulated fear but with the deliberate unfolding of truth. Harrow left the estate carrying not just documentation but understanding, knowledge of how institutionalized cruelty could persist, the architecture of fear and the way methodical evil manipulates perception to endure. The reckoning was complete, the Dobbins' power disrupted, but the lesson remained clear. Even the most hidden, disciplined malice leaves traces, and exposure, methodical and informed, can dismantle what fear has built. The town of Black Hollow had changed in subtle but irreversible ways. Harrow's investigation, the exposure of the Dobbins family, and the cataloging of decades of cruelty rippled through the community, leaving echoes in every household. The mansion, once a symbol of untouchable authority, now stood as a monument to secrecy unmasked, its walls empty but heavy with the memory of what had transpired. Within, locals began to speak in hushed tones of the child whose death had first revealed the darkness, of the rooms that manipulated fear, of the carefully orchestrated rituals that had defined a family's methodical psychopathy. Even those who had once refused to notice, to question, or to confront found themselves haunted by the knowledge of what had been allowed to persist unchecked. The town council initiated investigations that had long been considered impossible, uncovering the bureaucratic complacency that had enabled the Dobbins' sustained cruelty. Laws were amended, ordinances revised, and mechanisms put in place to prevent the recurrence of similar abuses. Black Hollow, a town that had slept under the shadow of the Dobbins for generations, began to awaken. Harrow documented not only the family's crimes but also the subtle ways evil can embed itself within institutions, family structures, and social expectations. He noted how silence becomes compliance, how charm and normalcy can mask meticulous malevolence, and how human perception can be conditioned to accept the unthinkable as routine. These reflections formed a chilling testament to the nature of hidden psychopathy. The quiet, persistent erosion of morality under the guise of normalcy, the slow manipulation of trust and authority, the transformation of domestic spaces into instruments of terror. Survivors, once silenced, began to recount their experiences in therapy sessions, interviews, and local gatherings, each story reinforcing the breadth of the Dobbins' influence. The narrative was no longer confined to the mansion or the family. It had entered the collective memory of the town, shaping consciousness, awareness, and vigilance. Harrow emphasized the deliberate layering of trauma in his reports, how symbolic acts of ritualized control intersected with psychological conditioning to produce fear, obedience, and submission. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were systematized, engineered, and maintained across generations. Memorials were erected for the victims, simple plaques in town squares and cemeteries marking names and dates. a public acknowledgement of pain that had long been ignored. Families who had lost children or relatives could finally see recognition of the suffering imposed by a methodical mind that had hidden behind civility. Academics, psychologists, and criminologists examined the mansion's design, the family's rituals, and Harrow's findings to understand the mechanisms of hidden evil. Studies were initiated on how architecture, ritual, and social compliance can reinforce psychopathy, producing insights that extended beyond Black Hollow and into wider social awareness. The Dobbins legacy paradoxically became a cautionary tale, illustrating both the dangers of silence and the necessity of vigilance. Harrow reflected on the enduring nature of evil, noting that even when dismantled, its imprint remains on memory, architecture, and social consciousness. The mansion would eventually be preserved as a historical site, a physical record of the strategies employed by the Dobbins to maintain control, and a resource for educating future generations on the hidden dimensions of human cruelty. Survivors, townsfolk, and visitors alike would confront the realization that evil does not always manifest in dramatic violence. Often it lives quietly, hidden in the ordinary, in obedience, in the unspoken, and in spaces designed to normalize terror. Harrow's final reports emphasize that vigilance, documentation, and moral courage are essential tools against hidden psychopathy. The Dobbins had relied on fear, secrecy, and manipulation to preserve power. Exposure, methodical and informed, dismantled these mechanisms, but only after decades of suffering. The philosophical weight of this legacy was clear. Society cannot rely solely on instinct to recognize evil. It must question, investigate, and confront even when discomfort, tradition, or civility suggest otherwise. In the quiet moments following the exposure, Harrow walked through Black Hollow's streets, noting the subtle shifts in community behavior, the cautious conversations of neighbors, and the wary awareness in children's eyes. There was fear, yes, but also hope. Hope that knowledge, acknowledgement, and remembrance could prevent recurrence. The town's collective memory had been expanded, its consciousness sharpened, its vigilance awakened. Evil once hidden had been mapped, documented, and confronted, leaving a blueprint not for terror but for prevention. The shadows of the Dobbins lingered, as all shadows do, but they no longer commanded the light. They had been relegated to history, to lesson, and to warning. Black Hollow had survived, scarred but informed, a living testament to both the fragility and resilience of human morality. Harrow's final reflections would be published in a comprehensive report, a document intended not to sensationalize but to educate, to analyze, and to memorialize. It would remind readers that methodical cruelty can hide behind familiarity, that evil often operates in silence, and that courage, observation, and documentation are vital defenses against its persistence. The mansion stood empty now, a hollowed monument to decades of cruelty and secrecy, its grand halls echoing with the absence of life, yet heavy with the lingering presence of the Dobbins' meticulous evil. Black Hollow had endured, but the town carried invisible scars, a collective consciousness shaped by fear, loss, and revelation. Harrow's final work focused not on the dramatic spectacle of the crimes themselves, but on the subtle mechanics of methodical psychopathy, the way ordinary spaces and ordinary behaviors had been twisted into instruments of terror. He traced the influence of silence, how townsfolk avoided questions, how authority was trusted without scrutiny, how the polite facade of civility masked a deliberate orchestration of pain. The Dobbins' mastery had been in invisibility, in blending the ordinary with the sinister, in convincing others that their rituals and manipulations were inconsequential or beyond understanding. Families once bound to the estate by social expectation now spoke openly of lost children, of unaccounted disappearances, of nights spent with doors locked against unspoken dread. Therapy groups formed, historians cataloged documents, and local schools incorporated discussions about morality, obedience, and vigilance into lessons on civic responsibility. Harrow documented how exposure not only dismantled the family's immediate control, but also transformed the town's relationship with authority, fear, and collective responsibility. The mansion itself, now preserved as a historical site, served as both a warning and an educational tool. Visitors walked its corridors knowing the walls had witnessed calculated cruelty, psychological conditioning, and ritualistic control. They saw the chambers designed to isolate, manipulate, and terrify, the instruments of methodical torment, and the architectural spaces that had facilitated obedience. Each detail, once invisible, was now codified in public memory, a record of what happens when evil hides behind normalcy and the familiar. Harrow emphasized the psychological weight carried by those who survived and those who had borne witness without the power to intervene. Trauma, he noted, did not vanish with the fall of a family. It persisted in memory, in anxiety, in a subtle wariness of trust and authority. Yet alongside the pain there was knowledge, awareness, and a renewed commitment to questioning appearances, to holding institutions accountable, and to honoring the experiences of the vulnerable. The philosophical reflection was stark. Evil rarely shouts. It whispers, insinuates, and embeds itself in human systems, preying on silence, obedience, and ignorance. The Dobbins had thrived not because of overt violence alone, but because society allowed fear, custom, and civility to override curiosity, empathy, and intervention. Harrow's final narrative connected this understanding to a broader lesson: the moral imperative to confront wrongdoing, even when uncomfortable, and to document, preserve, and disseminate knowledge as a safeguard against repetition. In town meetings, classrooms, and historical exhibits, discussions emphasized vigilance over complacency, moral courage over passive acceptance, and recognition of subtle manipulation over dismissal of minor irregularities. Survivors were encouraged to tell their stories, knowing that their testimonies carried the power to prevent future atrocities. The town of Black Hollow, forever altered, became a living repository of these lessons. The Dobbins' downfall illustrated that even the most disciplined, ritualistic, and hidden malice leaves traces in architecture, behavior, memory, and social structures, and that methodical exposure can dismantle entrenched cruelty. Harrow concluded with the undeniable human truth. Evil persists when silence persists, but knowledge and courage are capable of severing its roots. The final pages of his work urged reflection on personal responsibility, societal awareness, and the moral duty to observe and intervene. The mansion's corridors, once instruments of control, now echoed with education, awareness, and remembrance. Visitors encountered reminders of suffering, of obedience warped into terror, of innocence betrayed by calculated minds. These echoes became lessons, the silent testimony of victims rendered permanent through documentation and memorial. Harrow left Black Hollow with a sense of cautious accomplishment, aware that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the broader vigilance required to prevent recurrence rested in every individual, family, and institution. His final words, intended for readers and the townsfolk alike, lingered with ethical weight. The world permits evil to grow where curiosity dies, where civility suppresses inquiry, and where fear overrides conscience. The story of the Dobbins family was complete, their power extinguished, yet their legacy remained. A blueprint of methodical cruelty, an enduring caution, and a challenge to every observer. In the quiet streets, among the preserved estate, and in the memories of survivors, Black Hollow carried the dual truth of vulnerability and resilience. Evil had been confronted, documented, and memorialized. The question now rested with the living. Could this happen again elsewhere to others in silence and in shadow? Awareness, courage, and remembrance were the only defenses. The story ended not with resolution but with reflection, leaving viewers with an unsettling, deliberate understanding. Hidden psychopathy thrives when it is unseen, methodical, and normalized, and its defeat requires deliberate attention, moral clarity, and the willingness to act. Black Hollow had survived, scarred and wiser, and its lessons were etched not only into history but into the consciousness of all who bore witness. What do you think? Could this happen again?